This is a special episode of Affinity Talks Gospel. For this episode, Lizzie Harewood is joined by our guest host, Adam May, a communication and ministry consultant. And they're going to be interviewing me, Graham Nicholls, about the Gospel Coalition and our plans for the UK.
Hi, my name's Adam May, and you're listening to the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast.
And I'm Lizzie Harewood, and we are here today to speak to Graham Nicholls. We're going to focus on the news that Affinity has been thinking about forming a branch of the Gospel Coalition UK. We're going to speak to Graham, ask him about some of the details, the background to this, and perhaps as well some of the concerns that have been raised in the wider evangelical community. So, Graham, you are potentially championing the formation of the Gospel Coalition UK. Can you tell us a bit of the background to this, how this conversation happened?
Yeah, I think as Affinity, there's a perpetual conversation to say, are we doing something useful? We're doing some good things. Could we do some better things, or could we just stop doing what we're doing entirely and someone else can do the things we're doing? So there's always that conversation. I think you've always got to have that as a parachurch organization. It should be a constant conversation. Are we actually useful? With the church, it's more defined. You know what you're there for. That's the engine of evangelism and discipleship and so on. With the parachurch organization, it's, are we helping the church? Are we helping the gospel? So we have that conversation ongoing, and then into that sort of conversation, someone just threw one day, quite casually, the thought, what about forming the Gospel Coalition? There's been Gospel Coalition, not so much branches, but people who've wanted to associate with them around the world. I wonder why there isn't one in the UK. I wonder if this would be a good direction to go in. So it just started off as just a conversation between three of us, and then it grew into a conversation within the Affinity leadership, and then I started consulting outside the Affinity leadership, and then we as a leadership came back together to say, well, here's all that we think, and here's what, the consultation we've had, and so forth. And so we came to that decision. The background in terms of the usefulness sort of argument was, could we gather a group of people around what is clustered around a reformed, historical, kind of orthodox understanding of faith, similar to the Gospel Coalition? Could we do that? And would that be a broader coalition than an Affinity currently is? Could it kind of breathe new life into church unity? Could it be helpful to those groups of churches, some of whom are in Affinity but perhaps not being impacted by Affinity, and some who are outside of Affinity and could benefit from this new kind of engine of useful gospel content and encouragement and unity and so on? And the conclusion I came to was, I think this could be incrementally useful. How useful partly depends on people participating, getting involved, accessing and so on. So you can't quantify in a sort of business plan sense. All you can do is say, will this be good, and will it actually be better than what I'm currently doing? And if it is, then God can use it, and hopefully he will use it. So yeah, that's a bit of the background.
Can you explain a bit why it might have that broader reach? So as far as I'm aware, Affinity's roots were in the kind of the British Evangelical Council.
Yes.
And then churches and other parachurch organisations sort of left other denominations potentially to join it or to affiliate. How would this then have a broader reach? What is it about the Gospel Coalition that might reach people that aren't already affiliated with Affinity?
Yeah, I think partly to do with history and partly to do with being a trusted brand. So in terms of history, as you say, the British Evangelical Council was formed actually in 1952. And although it was positively about unity around the gospel, there was a degree of negativity about it, in that it was trying to react against churches together, ecumenicalism that wasn't based around the gospel. So it was a bit of a negative reaction to say, we can't join with these, but we do want to express gospel unity in this way. But inevitably that sort of caught up in its wake people who were gospel people who they separated from. And in particular, Affinity was on the if you could call it this way, the Martin Lloyd-Jones side of the Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Stott arguments that happened, and there's a famous thing at Kiel that kind of formed a bit of a division between conservative evangelicals in the kind of free churches and the mainstream Church of England. And so there is a bit of history that means that Affinity was a little bit exclusive. Not by the time I got involved in it, but in its kind of essence when I got involved with it. There still is that bit of history. But the other thing is to do with recognition. We could just keep bashing away with Affinity. Affinity is growing in terms of corporate members, agency members particularly, and I think we do lots of good things. So we could, and we can, and we might just carry on, as we are. But the Gospel Coalition, or something like it, is a very well-known international brand, and lots of people in the UK who are in Affinity recognise the Gospel Coalition more than they recognise Affinity. So if you put the fact that there's been a lot of work gone into getting that brand recognised, do we want to kind of do all the work to get to that point when it's already there, when theologically we're pretty much aligned with where the Gospel Coalition is and what its aims are? So there is a bit of sort of common sense and not being so arrogant to think, well, we can build up and we can be that. Maybe this is just a quicker route, and also, just humanly speaking, when you do something fresh and you say this is not Affinity, this is something new, genuinely something new that you can start at ground level and form, it's more likely to bring people in rather than saying, we formed this, do you want to come and join it? So I don't know if that made sense. There's different strands of thinking about it.
That definitely helps. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I just want to post, because I remember the day that you told me about the fact that three of you had been together and you were having a thought about this Gospel Coalition. I remember it well. I remember sitting in exactly the same place, and you were sitting there. I can't remember what shirt you were wearing, but I do remember you telling me. And I remember you asking me the question, and because of the work that I do for Affinity, but also wider, what's going on in terms of the evangelical landscape in the UK? Because part of the reason for me, as you look at the Gospel Coalition, is understanding what's going on in the evangelical landscape. And I remember you asking the question of me, Graham, and I remember telling you what I thought, but obviously you've had a lot more conversations than when you first asked me that question. You've been talking to other people. What's your sense as you look at the evangelical landscape of the UK church?
I think there is a lot of change going on in the mainstream denominations. There is rapid and in some cases terminal decline happening, with various pockets of orthodox evangelicals in them who are confused and perplexed by what's going on in their denominations. There is churches from other nations that have come here because people have come here. So there's that going on. There is all kind of challenges to do with sexual ethics. There is a kind of grabbing of the word evangelical by people that I don't think are gospel people. There are issues to do with carefully working out what we mean by complementarian, what we mean by male headship, and those debates to have, and people who are kind of completely opposed to even accepting of that as a piece of Bible teaching, and perhaps people who are too, not rigorously, that rigorous is good, but too simply kind of applying that. So there's lots of stuff going on and lots of new fault lines forming. So that's in terms of landscape. In terms of reaction, they are slightly a self-selecting group of people, because obviously people I end up talking to are people who are willing to talk to me. But of the people that are willing to talk to me, virtually everyone, I'm not exaggerating, I would say 90%, maybe even more, are positive about the idea, but with cautions. And they think it could breathe new life into, I don't really like the word, but we use the word conservative evangelicalism, breathe new life into conservative evangelical unity. I don't want to be so ambitious that I think I can unite everyone who's a Christian. You have to be kind of realistic, a bit like you do in your own church, to think, well, in my town, maybe there are 3 churches that are evangelical. Maybe there should be just one, but they have to be realistic about they have some different theology and some different practice and culture and history and so on, and we accept that under God. And I think it's the same with Christian organizations. It's better to go for something where you can cluster around a set of beliefs and practices that you're confident are both biblical and good. That's what we do.
So what would be perhaps the questions from those that are saying proceed with caution? What would they be saying be cautious about?
Yeah.
Is it the link with the US and the differing cultural landscapes?
Yes. All of those things.
Yeah.
I think there's a fundamental question which I totally get, and I want to make sure we answer in whatever we do, which is, what useful gospel purpose does this serve? So I think that's the fundamental one, to say, do we need another parachurch organization? And to answer it in terms of, well, what useful thing for the gospel could this do? And there's lots of Christian organizations who are based in the UK, parachurch organizations in the UK. There's already lots of networks. There's already conferences that happen, and actually conferences that are, struggling to get enough people to come to, and so forth. But having said that, I still believe that we need encouragement to confidently declare the gospel. And I still think we need more visible unity, especially amongst what we would call conservative evangelicals, broadly reformed evangelicals. And I think we still need more voices in the media. So I think there's an answer to that question, but I think we've got to answer that and answer it at a kind of visionary level. What is this going to do? But also answer it at a practical level. What is this going to do? So then the other objections, just to get to them, are something to do with American culture. So some would say, why do we want to import an American model? It's different in Britain. I totally get that. And my answer to that question is always, whatever we do here will be run by us, will be owned by us, will be governed by us, and we'll have British content and British speakers and so on, and use the benefit of an international network that we can connect with, but to use it in a way that's helpful for the UK. Questions about American culture wars, importing those, and I totally accept we're not in quite the same space, but I think you can over exaggerate that. There's questions about, well, weren't there leadership failures in Gospel Coalition in the States? And I say, yep, there were, and there's been leadership failures over here as well. And we've got to look at what the organization is now and what they're seeking to do, and are they biblically faithful, and are they, people who are on fire for Christ and the gospel. Other objections are to do with the Gospel Coalition brand is too woke, because they did a Martin Luther King Day, and they did a few other things. Or other people say, well, it's not woke enough because it's quite a reformed confessional statement. So kind of people either side of that argument. So there's some of the debates.
Would I be right in thinking, Graham, because I've been doing some digging since you first started talking about it, and actually I jumped when I thought that I had the opportunity to ask you questions, because this is a special edition of the Affinity Talks Gospel podcast, and I'm sure there are people who maybe aren't listening to other episodes of the Affinity Talks Gospel podcast, but I encourage you to do so. Graham and Lizzie host that. I'm just kind of stepping in, but because of the fact that of doing some digging around this as part of preparing for this podcast, am I right in thinking, Graham, that there are some people already in the UK that are engaged in the Gospel Coalition?
There are. So there are people who belong to sort of subsets of the Gospel Coalition. There's the Tim Keller organization and the Don Carson. I can't remember which one's called a foundation and one's called something else. But there are people who write for that. So there are people in the UK like Dan Strange, Glenn Scrivener, Andrew Wilson, who already write for the Gospel Coalition and are positive about that, and travel over there and get involved in forums and so on, and speaking at their conferences. So there are people already connected. Brand is an interesting thing, because it does sound very carnal and worldly, and say, our brand is to do with marketing and it's all of the devil. And you have to just say, no, it's not. It's to do with a trusted organization, and it's just normal human behavior, in the same way that you may go and hear a preacher that you know is a faithful preacher. That's a brand in a sense. As long as you're not using it in a manipulative way. Brands are just how humans have a shorthand way of being able to make decisions about what to listen to. It's just how we behave. It's been fascinating in just even making the announcement, the amount of coverage this gets compared to some of the other affinity things. It's partly because it's a controversy, but it's also because there's just a greater brand recognition, so more people have heard of it. Loads of people, even the people who disagree sometimes, with what we're doing, and that's not mainly been people who've spoken to me, it's just, people on social media. They will say things like, they will say things to display a knowledge of the Gospel Coalition that they don't have of Affinity, or they will say, I love their material, I use it all the time, but I don't think you should do this or whatever. But it just goes to show the brand recognition is that much higher. If that answered the question at all, I got distracted.
Does that then create the danger potentially that when there is an implication for the brand, someone heavily involved in that brand is, and you've kind of semi-answered this already,
yeah.
But does it then mean that, the whole gospel witness is in danger if we all sort of coalesce underneath this brand? Or does it actually mean that when we have lots of groups, we have perhaps safety in the diversity of those groups?
Yeah, I think ultimately that there is a risk. There's obviously risks involved in something that you don't control. So the Gospel Coalition in America does something completely heretical or so unbelievably clumsy, that's not heresy, but just is very unwise and provokes, some international reaction. Obviously, you will get dragged along with that. You can only make a judgment to say, I don't think that is highly likely. I think most things that the Gospel Coalition have been involved in have been fairly well contained, debates where maybe people have done things that are not right, and so forth, but they've been reasonably well contained and understood. So I think you've got to make a kind of risk calculation. Is this likely to happen? But you also got to make the statement that, what's the worst that can happen? In all my life in business and other things, I always think, what's the worst that can happen and how can we deal with it? What's the worst that can happen is a disaster, in which case we say it's a disaster. We're governed by the UK. We're legally owned in the UK. We'll just walk away from it. And hopefully if we're doing good things, which are useful for the gospel, we'll carry on doing good things. That's how I think about it.
And with the mixed feelings kind of flying around, how are you ensuring that the constituent members, their voice gets heard, as well as all the kind of the people from the outside, giving their 2 pence, whatever the phrase is? We know what the opinion is of those members.
Yeah, I mean, I've encouraged our members to write in or call in or chat with me, and lots of them have. So there's just that dialogue. So in terms of Affinity members, trying to listen to all of those. Obviously, there's representative groups in the council and across all the agencies, so I try and speak to them. We had an agency meeting recently that you were at, Lizzie, and just asking opinions. And some people wrote some things after that meeting, so that's really good. So I'm listening, I think, in that sense. To people who want to participate, I in both the press release and now I'm saying, talk to me about it, and we want to hear your voice. Of course, there are people who basically don't want us to do it for a variety of reasons, and there's a limit to how much you can listen to. You can only listen to the arguments. It's a bit pointless getting someone to participate if they're basically not supportive of what you're trying to achieve. So. And that's absolutely fine, that they don't think it's a good idea. All you can do is listen to them and try and understand what they're saying and think, does this mean I should stop? Or does this mean I need to refine what we're doing? Or does this mean I need to just communicate better what we're doing? And hopefully we'll do those things.
just picking up on what Lizzie was sharing there about being open and having the door open, and part of the reason that you can read things, and we all read things, and we read things into things that aren't there, and all of that kind of thing, and that's why doing this podcast is fantastic. And I know you and I, Graham, have talked with other members of the Affinity team and council members about saying the door is genuinely open. If somebody who isn't part of Affinity but is going, do you know what? I think I've got something. I want to get together on a Zoom like we're recording this Affinity Talks Gospel podcast. I want to get on a Zoom and have a proper conversation with you, Graham. How do people get in touch with you, just so we can have that level of consultation? Because I think one of the things that I've seen, and Lizzie, you and I were talking about this before we click the record to this podcast, is many people have made their mind up on how this conversation ends before they've even heard what's going on. So how do people get in touch with you, Graham, so that those that don't just want to throw stones but have got something constructive to engage in the conversation can? How do people get in touch with you, Graham?
They can engage with me by connecting with me on Twitter, X now, but also on Affinity Talks, but also they can just email director@affinity.org.uk. I don't get much spam, so I do get mostly genuine emails, and some people have from outside the Affinity family have just made contact and shown some interest. Some people I've taken the initiative and spoken to them. But yeah, you're right. It's really difficult in these situations to provide the right amount of transparency. We did a press release, which was a bit controversial, to be fair, within Affinity, because obviously some people say, well, why don't we wait until we've got a bit further along the line? And I said, no, we want to put it out there now and provoke people to either agree or disagree, because we want to know, how this goes down, as in how this is being received and how this is being perceived. So we put out the press release to say this is what we're thinking. I think we were really clear. To some people that isn't transparent enough, and some people say, well, why don't you publish minutes of your meetings, or why don't you say exactly who you've spoken to? And I just don't think that's a practical, realistic, or kind actually way to deal with people. People I've spoken to will eventually get involved or not get involved, but they need the respect of being able to kind of not be scrutinized for quite where they're at. But similarly, to do with saying this is what we're going to do, we want to know what the church wants. I've got a vision for a resource hub, for a fellowship, connection and conferences and prayer for the nation and things like that. I've got a vision for public voice. Those are my ideas. What I don't want to do is say, this is what we're doing. Do you agree or disagree? What I want to say is, here's a vision. You might want to change the vision, shape the vision, give me another point of something to think about, and be part of that conversation. That's a difficult path to steer, where you provide enough leadership that people don't just sit around and say, well, what are we going to do? But it's not so finished that they say, well, I've got nothing to participate in because the decision's been made. The decision hasn't been made. I've just got a few ideas and a bit of a vision, but I need people to share and shape the vision.
I wonder, just picking up on that, you've talked to council members on this and talked about the fact that it feels like kind of your three ideas, as you said, the resource hub, the greater vision for unity across conservative evangelicals, and that public voice. Just give us a bit more detail, put a bit more flesh on the bones, as the phrase goes, for each of those three areas. What does each of the three areas look like? Just again, so people have heard you say it.
Absolutely. I think that the difficult to place a perfect order out of the first two, but fellowship, connection, partnership, I think is central. Visible partnership at a local and a national level. I want to encourage what is currently the gospel partnerships to think, could we broaden and deepen what we're doing, and the connections that we have. I want to encourage more prayer for gospel work. I want to encourage more routes for people to be equipped. I think there's an encouragement for the church as a whole when they see visible unity, in terms of people working together, maybe some conferences at a local and national level. So I think there's value in visible unity. It's not just a parade. I think it genuinely helps people, but I think there's apologetic value in visible unity as well. I think it helps when people outside the church see that we're united. And I think although I don't want to be uniting with the whole of everyone who's a Christian in the UK. I want to show that although we are specific, I suppose you could say, as a cluster, we also want to recognize and cheer on other gospel work that's happening. So visible unity, point number one. Second point, in terms of Resource Hub, there's loads of good content in the UK, like there's loads of good content on the Gospel Coalition website in the States. I want to be a hub for that good content, a little bit from the States, but actually mostly British content, produced here for here. Some of it original, some of it new, that hopefully we can get some momentum going with commissioning some more works. I think in the UK, we do a good job of not just blogging and other articles, but also video blogging and other ways of engagement. And I want to be a resource hub for that, which is useful for equipping the church, but also useful apologetically. And then the third thing is a public voice. We've talked about. I do a little bit of media work. Lizzie and Adam, you do some, but there's relatively few conservative evangelical voices in the media at all, and it tends to be on fairly narrow issues. I think there's much more opportunity, and somehow I want to try and help the church get to a point where there's some more resource and some more thinking going on to how can we drive the agenda more. And get more stories out there and engage on lots of issues, on a broader range of issues than just being on the defensive about sexual ethics or assisted dying or abortion, all of which are really important topics. And we want to hold back the tide of evil on all those areas. But there's lots of other things Christians have a view on as well. That's what we want to do, if that's enough things.
I love that. I love that vision. Lizzie, what are your thoughts as you hear Graham spell out that kind of vision?
What are your thoughts, Lizzie?
Interesting, because I would say that I would probably sat quite on the fence, not really having particularly strong views either way. Never really concerned me that we would be painted with any kind of critique that the US version, because I kind of knew, knowing you, that you would not be wedded to the kind of that kind of cultural not controversy, but those cultural issues, they wouldn't have any kind of authority in the way that this looked here. And I know that you would be keen to serve the gospel. I guess undoubtedly you're going to get critique from either side. You're going to get critique that that the Gospel Coalition is keen on social progress and that's some kind of wokeism. But then you get others who believe that the kind of the complementarian approach is a sign that it's somehow, I don't know, regressive. And I just think that sometimes when you're in that middle ground where you're getting a lot of flack from either side, that's not a bad place to be in.
Yeah.
I feel quite encouraged. I can't count the number of times a day I go on the Gospel Coalition website because I've been trying to find some information about a certain issue or, just finding something out theologically. I've been reading an article, and actually that's the thing. There is a profile there, and we mustn't necessarily be scared of profile because we think that it's a worldly thing to want to be associated with the brand. I think sometimes having a brand is a pragmatic way of connecting with society, with culture. And I think as long as we are careful making sure that that's a UK-centric thing, talking to our culture, but still maintaining those links with US friends and partners, I think why not proceed with caution? But yeah, it's not something that I'd kind of got myself worked up into a worry about. So I'm just seeing it as it is, really, I think.
Yeah.
if you've got a view, if you're listening to this, because I for us this is a conversation between Lizzie, Graham, and I, but actually we wanting to put this podcast out. So if you've got a view as you're listening to this, you're not reading a press release, but you're hearing a conversation, get in touch. Email office@affinity.org.uk if you want to send it anonymously, or if you want to get in touch with Graham directly, director@affinity.org.uk. Get in touch. Let us know. Is what Lizzie's saying right? Does that resonate, or is that a challenge? Get in touch and let us let us know what you think about this whole idea about having a UK gospel coalition. Because I'm sure everybody's got an opinion. Certainly, that's what we're seeing on social media. Graham, I want to just say though, one of the things that I have seen in terms of looking at my inbox for Affinity on this, people are saying, we've got the Evangelical Alliance. Why do we need the UK Gospel Coalition? Isn't it the same thing? How would you respond to that? Because that is the biggest question. And that's why now we've gone beyond sharing a bit of the vision. I want to go for the jugular question and say, there are other things going on. Is this really needed? What's the difference? What are the conversations that have been had with the Evangelical Alliance and others? What's going on?
It's a great question. And to be brutally honest, it is a question that I've circled around a few times. And I think the answer, which is the answer I've landed on, I think it's the correct answer, is that on the one hand, we have as Affinity, and we want as the Gospel Coalition UK to have excellent relationships with Evangelical Alliance. I personally know the guys there, get on really well with them, have common cause with them in a number of areas. And I would want and want that to continue into the future. But I think just as there are maybe more, as I mentioned earlier, more than one church in a town, and there are both historical, cultural, and theological reasons for that, I think the Gospel Coalition will help a whole group of churches and Christians who, for theological, cultural, and historical reasons, just don't want at this point to be associated with the Evangelical Alliance. I also think that it works in a slightly different way in terms of the way it's constituted. We want to, whatever we do with the Gospel Coalition, there is something really good about Affinity in the way it represents Christian organizations and churches, and that's the engine of how we make decisions, which I want to replicate. So I think that would be a different thing. I think theologically being clustered around Reformation understanding would be a good thing. And that's not where the Evangelical Alliance is at. I don't think it's practically possible or useful to try and say absolutely every Christian who understands the gospel should somehow be able to come under the same umbrella. I think it's completely legitimate and reasonable to have an organization that more represents your theological understanding, the way you do church, what your priorities are in church life and so forth, and to really encourage that and to be unashamed of that, but be generous at the same time. My maybe rather rose-colored kind of vision is, wouldn't it be great if the Gospel Coalition prospered and Evangelical Alliance prospered? We continue to be good friends, to encourage each other, work together where we can work together, work separately where working separately is better, encourage the growth of the kind of churches that the Gospel Coalition want to encourage, Evangelical Alliance by all means encourage the churches they want to encourage. And if there's loads more Christians, then God is glorified and I'm happy.
Mm-hmm. Great answer.
That's a really good answer. I'm glad that we can address that question head on. Yeah. This is a short and shorter than normal Affinity Talks Gospel podcast, but it's really important that we've done this. So please do. I'm going to keep saying it because we want your feedback. The whole reason for having this recording is so we can get your feedback. So again, email office@affinity.org.uk, or if you want to send something anonymously, that gets filtered back into the team, or if you want to email Graham directly, because Graham, you're right, you're up for any conversation with anybody.
I am.
In which case, I'll give out Graham's email address, director@affinity.org.uk. But Graham, what happens next? What's the kind of time scale? I know from working with you, you describe yourself as being a bit of an impatient person. Yes. So what happens next?
Yeah, there's my timescale, there's everyone else's timescale, and then there's God's timescale. And I'm not quite sure which is the right one. Obviously, God's, but if it was down to me, I'd have it all sorted by the summer holidays, but it's not. So I think we're going to get together with a broader group of people outside Affinity, with a few from inside Affinity, go through the vision, talk about what the church needs, get everyone to go away and pray and think about it, and maybe chat with their networks or whatever. I'm hoping under God that we could do something by the end of the year, to get it agreed in principle by the end of the year and up and running in the first part of next year. That would be my aim. I know I'm a bit unrealistic sometimes in these things, but that would be my aim.
Well, that's encouraging to go, as I say, wanting to do things in God's time, but also, as I say, very much wanting to get this right. That's what I'm hearing you say, Graham.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, before we close, you are listening to the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. I feel like I need to be on commission for saying that. I'll be saying that in my sleep. But if you haven't heard the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast, Graham and Lizzie host that. Lizzie, what other things have you been talking about recently on the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast that people might want to go back and hear to give a bit of a taste of some of the things that we're talking about in the Affinity world?
Gosh, there are lots. So focusing on different aspects or different members of the Affinity kind of family. Gosh, that's a bit, I don't know whether you call it the Affinity family.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So different ministries. So, for example, we did one on the Association of Christian Teachers, the work that we're doing with Christians working in education, focused on the work of CARE and James Mildred, and the work that he's doing there to facilitate Christians getting involved in politics, be that local or national politics, and also interviewed members who have particular expertise in church history, in Scotland, in Wales, in England. So there's something really for everyone. There's something there to float your boat if you're interested in sort of gospel work going on up and down the country. We did a recording with London City Mission. So there's everything from kind of whole faith missional work to those that are able to give us a bit of an overview of the incredible gospel heritage our country has. But it's all gospel-centered, gospel work in the UK. What's going on? What can we be so thankful to God for? And what can we be praying for amongst the constituent members?
And I was going to be cheeky and ask Graham, what's been your favourite podcast? But I won't ask that. But actually, Graham, just as we come into close, because it feels like a different kind of a podcast that we've been doing. People who will have now listened to this conversation in the light of the podcast, in the light of social media, it's probably and hopefully going to provoke questions, comments, and we've already said get in touch. So I'm not going to say that again. But Graham, would you just conclude our time just by praying that actually both for those that are listening, because the thing that struck me most about the conversation that we've just had is we want to have constructive conversation wherever constructive conversation can be found, whether you're part of the Affinity family at the moment, and if you are, it's great to have you part of that family, or whether you're not, and you kind of go, do you know what, with the formation of a gospel coalition here in the UK, I might want to come and be part of that family. So people will be listening to this for a whole range of different reasons. But Graham, would you just pray for those that are listening to this podcast that they would know how to appropriately respond to the conversation that they've heard?
Yeah, I will do. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. And it's always a bit weird praying on a recording, but God is supreme in his understanding, and whether he hears it played lots of times and whatever time of day or night that you're listening to this, then it's still a prayer that God hears and you can participate in. So let's pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, that we can be reconciled to God through him. And we pray that whatever we decide as your servants about the Gospel Coalition, about the future of Affinity, about the future of gospel unity in the UK, that whatever we decide, we are thinking your thoughts after you, that we are doing what is honourable to you, we are doing what is helpful to the church, which builds people up in their faith and introduces more people to Jesus. Give us great wisdom and unity as we step together, as we work for you and for your glory. Help us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel